On today's program, former host Ray Campbell has an update on his container vegetable garden. Extension entomologist Eric Rebeck has squash bug information. Extension entomologist Jackie Lee looks at a couple of unwanted insects in our peach trees. Extension stormwater specialist Jason Vogel has tips for rainwater harvesting. Assistant Extension Specialist Jen Olson covers the 4 most common fruit tree diseases seen this year. And Barbara Brown cooks black beans and rice. Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance is provided by TLC, Oklahoma's leading garden center, Southwood Landscape and Nursery, Tulsa's source for great gardens, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing.
Well, we've had a lot of questions and a lot of interest in the little container garden. I call it the expanded kitchen garden that I made in the patio several weeks ago on Oklahoma Gardening, and I just kind of wanted to give you a little update on that. It's really doing well. It seems like it might be a little bit crowded, but it seems to be happy. The herbs have done very well. We've used a lot of herbs out of this, a lot of the parsley and the basil and the bronze fennel we've used already, and you can see how the jalapenos have set on, doing very well. Banana pepper is beginning to produce now. We've got the tomato down here, my little patio tomato that has got quite a bit of fruit set on it. Our cucumbers are blooming well. We don't have any cucumbers yet, but I suspect that this cucumber before too long will be setting a lot of fruit on it. And remember, this was the little bush boy cucumber, I believe, was the one that we used in this. And so, no, the bush champion, as my label says. So that's why I label things, so I can remember. But the nasturtiums are flowering well. They make, of course, nice garnishes for your plate. Some people even use these as an edible flower in salads, and on the decoration on the plate, of course, can be edible. So I'm really proud of the little kitchen garden that we've got growing here. It's created not only a lot of interest on the segments that we've watched and the response we've got back and the feedback we've got from Oklahoma Gardening, but also from neighbors and friends and family as well. So if you've not planted your kitchen garden yet, or your small vegetable patio garden, it's not too late. Remember, you can always pick this up and move it if you're going to another location, or pick it up and move it into a different part of the patio or the deck if it gets too hot where it is sitting at this present time. So I hope you try one of these if you've not tried one yet.
Squash bugs. The very name sends shivers up the spine of the gardener. As the name implies, these are insects, true bugs, that like to feed on squash. However, they will feed on a wide variety of cucurbit plants, typically preferring squash, and then also feeding on pumpkins, watermelons, cantaloupe, and cucumbers, in that order. The squash bugs are generally the most common and most prevalent pest of cucurbit crops in Oklahoma. They do have piercing, sucking mouthparts. They cause damage to the leaves and also can feed on fruits once they're developed by inserting their piercing, sucking mouthparts and feeding on the plant sap and plant juices. Typically, we will start to see infestations of squash bugs in our cucurbit crops starting around April or May, as the adults are emerging from their overwintering sites, either in the garden or in the surrounding environment. Upon entering the crop in April or May again, they'll start to mate and they'll begin to lay eggs. And those eggs are typically laid on the underside of the leaves of their house plants. Now crops can tolerate a moderate amount of squash bugs, so it's usually when we get the heavy infestations that we notice appreciable damage on the plants themselves. Again, they're feeding on those leaves and sometimes on those fruits. The plants, once they're heavily infested, are going to start to suffer, and we're going to see a reduction in fruit quality and quantity. So something needs to be done at that point. So we can look at a few cultural management strategies for squash bugs. Firstly, we can try to choose varieties of squash that are less preferred. Typically we're talking about royal acorn and butternut squash. These are more favorable, these are less favorable for squash bugs than things like summer squash and pumpkin squash. If it's too late and we haven't planted those varieties, we have highly preferred varieties in the ground at that point, we can resort to cultural management strategies. Firstly, you can try to find those egg masses that are laid on the undersides of the leaves and try to squash them. You can also look for nymphs and adults and try to squash them as well. Just beware, they do release a pretty noxious odor as you're trying to handle them and crush them. If that's not sufficient enough, we can also do some other tricks. We can plant, or we can place 2x4s in the vine row in between our squash beds. And the squash bugs have a habit of trying to reside underneath the boards and other structures. So in the early morning we can go out and we can flip those boards over and we can direct our management strategy, our treatment, right where those bugs are congregating. Whether it be insecticide or crushing and those sorts of things. And then there are chemical control options. So recent studies have shown that there are certain insecticides that work best for different life stages of squash bug. Now there are 5 nymphal stages of the squash bugs before they molt into the adult stage. What works best against the nymphs, and that's typically the stage we're going to try to control because they are most susceptible to insecticides, those studies have shown that products that contain Spinosad, the active ingredient Spinosad in them, will work best against those nymphal stages, both young and older nymphs. Once they get to the adult stage, we have to resort to some other chemicals. Typically, we're looking at active ingredients that include pyrethrins as well as cypermethrin, so some of the pyrethroid-based insecticides. So as with many garden insects, vigilance is key. We need to continuously monitor at least a couple times a week, closely looking at our plants for the development of the pest in those plants. With squash bug management, it's very important to try to eliminate that first overwintering adult population as it comes into the crop and eliminate those adults as well as any eggs that have been deposited from that first generation. Because as we control that first generation, we're going to see long-term benefits over the course of the season with reduced pest pressure from squash bugs.
Who doesn't like fresh peaches right off of the tree? I know I do. I'm here today to talk about certain insect pests of fruit trees. And one thing I want to talk about is peach twig borer and Oriental fruit moth. These are 2 insect pests that cause wormy peaches. Now, who likes a wormy peach? And we're going to talk about ways that we can actually control these insects so you don't get worms in your peaches. So today I'm out in the garden and I'm looking at these peaches to see if there's any evidence that there's any insects out here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is examine the shoot tips on the trees. So what you would do is just grab a limb and look at the tip. You can see the tip of this limb has some damage, and this is what we would call a strike or flagging. You can see that it's brown and wilted and that an insect has burrowed into the end of the limb. Now this is characteristic Oriental fruit moth or peach twig borer damage. Now if you go through and you only find 1 or 2 of these, that's okay. But if you find 3 or more, you need to apply some type of control. Now once the peaches have already come onto the tree, it's a little too late for control. The insect can actually get into the peaches, and this is an example where the insect has gotten into the peach, and you can see the frass and then also oozing from the peach. It's a little too late to control it at this point. What you need to do is really put out of control during bloom. You need to put it out during pink bud stage or right after petal fall. And there's a lot of great products out there to control these pests. You can use a Spinosad product or a BT product, and you can get those at any box store. So apply something really early during bloom, and you will not have wormy peaches and can enjoy them all summer long.
Today we're at Bickham-Rutkin Park to talk about rainwater harvesting. So it's been raining a lot this year, and it gives us some opportunities to harvest rainwater to use for our landscape plants. And if we're going to do it the right way, we really need to get a large system so that we can collect all the water that we can. And a system generally starts off with a catchment area. How much water can you get off a catchment area? Well, on 1,000 square feet, we can get over 600 gallons of water from a 1-inch rainfall. That's a lot of water, so we need a pretty big tank to deal with that. But before we get to the tank, we need to have our system that's going to bring the water into a tank. Generally, that's going to be our gutter and some sort of piping. And along with that piping, we can have some things that we add to the system to help with our water quality. Those are things like roof washers and first flush diverters to help us remove some of that sediment and leaves and other things that have built up on the roof since the last time that it rained. So then we get into our tank. We can have over 1,000 gallons of storage if we want. Like I said, we can get 600 gallons off of a 1-inch rainfall. So the more water that we have, the more that we can utilize later on when it's not raining as much, so that we can use that on our landscape plants. So the tanks can be above ground, they can be below ground. But when the tanks are above ground, you're going to get a tank that's opaque so that the sun will not shine in and you will not get algae growing within the tank. If it's below ground, you can use a plastic tank or a concrete tank, and it's still going to store your water. You obviously don't have as much of an issue with algae. You do want to make sure and have as smooth surfaces as you can on the inside of it, because that'll give less surfaces for that algae to grow on. And then on the back side of the tank, you always want to make sure that you have an overflow. Because we're getting so much water off of our rooftop, big storm, we're going to still fill up even our larger tanks, and with those systems, you need to have a place where the water can overflow and it's not going to cause damage. So how big of a tank can we have? Well, we want to really design our system to store enough water to make up the rainfall deficit or the water deficit that you would have from the driest month that you would be using the system. So for instance, if you were trying to water your landscape, the driest month is probably going to be July and most months in Oklahoma. So we're going to go and we're going to find out how much rainfall is going to fall upon your landscape area that you're watering on, and then size a tank to make up for whatever the rainfall didn't give us during that month. For more information on large-scale rainfall harvesting, visit our rainwater harvesting website at lid.okstate.edu and click on the rainwater harvesting link.
It's been a rough year for fruit trees in Oklahoma, especially peaches and some of the related trees like nectarine, plums, and apricots. So I want to go over some of the 4 most common diseases that we've seen in the 2015 growing season. The first one is called leaf curl, and it actually started back in the spring when the leaves were just coming out, and this fungal disease caused those leaves to show weird distortions, sort of some puckering and blistering. And so if you saw this on your leaves in the spring, you might actually see the same kind of symptoms develop on the fruits later this year. Now, we do have a fact sheet on leaf curl that you can review all the management for this disease, which basically involves 2 fungicide applications to protect your trees. Another really common peach disease that we've seen is called brown rot. And brown rot is probably the most common peach disease in the US. You've probably, if you haven't seen it on your peach tree, you've probably seen it at the grocery store. And it gets its name because it causes the fruits, it'll start with a circular spot that will enlarge and get sort of brown and watery. As the fungus invades the fruit, eventually you'll start to see sort of a velvety growth, which is that fungus producing spores that are going to shoot out and infect leaves, the twigs, and other fruits on the tree. It's one that you really basically from bloom through your harvest time, you really have to spray with fungicides if you want to prevent this tree from developing on your peaches. Now, the most common disease that we've seen in this year that's been really rainy is actually what the problem is with the tree that is behind me, and it's called peach scab. So it'll cause these little spots to develop on the peach fruit, and they're usually most concentrated at the stem end. And as the season goes on, you may see more and more of those spots develop. You can see this peach is starting to get some color in it, and the spots are a little bit bigger. So if you're seeing this, this is another one that we can use preventative fungicides for, and the critical time for this is basically from when the petals fall until the pits become hard. So if you didn't know if you were at that pit hardening stage, you could just cut open one of the peaches and see if that pit is hard. Now at this point, this tree is not going to get any more lesions on the fruit, but the fungus is still active and it's actually causing lesions on the twigs. So we'll see small spots developing on these twigs throughout the season, and that's where this is going to overwinter. The last disease that I'll mention is a little bit different. It's a bacterial disease, and it causes a lot of lesions to develop on the leaves as well as the fruits. Now, the reason why this one is interesting is that this is actually from my own peach, and the plant has a little bit of resistance to this disease. So you can see some of the little red spots that will later turn brown. And as the tree recognizes it's being invaded, it's going to drop out those spots, causing this shot hole symptom where there's holy leaves. So you might think that something's been feeding on this, but it actually hasn't. It's just the plant trying to drop out that bacteria. Now, you may have spots develop on the fruits. Usually those spots look a little bit different than scab. They will be circular spots, but they're usually sunken and broken. And often around the spots, it looks kind of watery, sort of a symptom we call water soaking. Now, for any of these diseases, if you want to learn more, we have a couple of fact sheets you can look at. So there's one specifically on leaf curl, but we also have one that talks about all the common diseases that I've mentioned, as well as a few others. One of the things you can do if you haven't installed a tree yet is take a little bit of time to review some of the trees that we recommend for Oklahoma. In this fact sheet, for instance, we have list of resistance to bacterial leaf spot, and you might take a little time to see if any of the trees you're looking at have resistance to the other diseases as well. If you want to have very high quality peaches without blemishes, you are going to have to spray. So some of those spray guidelines are outlined in this fact sheet on home fruit tree production, but for a detailed list, you'll need to visit your county extension office and get a copy of the home fruit tree spray guide. If you want to have organically produced peaches, there's still chemical options for you. So just visit with your extension educator and they will help you find those. Now, other than these things, there's 3 things that you can do to prevent disease from developing on your peaches. Number 1 is avoid injury, whether it be from your lawnmower or taking care of any insect problems that might create wounds. Number 2 is keeping the plant dry. So if you have a very thick area of the plant, pruning out some branches to increase airflow so these leaves and fruits dry more quickly. And then the third thing is sanitation. So throughout the season, you're going to have peaches fall on the ground, leaves fall. You want to rake those up and discard them in the trash. And all of those 3 suggestions are great cultural methods that will help you have healthier plants overall, but will help reduce your disease pressure.
Today we're going to do black beans and rice. Now this may not seem like a really springy meal, but it does involve a lot of produce and can be something that you can extend through the summer. It's going to get better as you work through the summer and you're working with more fresh produce instead of some canned things. I've got 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil, and to that I'm going to add a medium onion that I've chopped up, a medium green bell pepper, a medium red bell pepper, and then because this has a bit of a Cajun flair to it, it's also going to have a lot of garlic. There's 4 cloves of garlic that have been minced here. Oh, this smells terrific. Going to let that cook for about 4 minutes. Now usually we don't add the garlic early on if it's sauteing on its own, but because we're sauteing it with a lot of other vegetables that are going to start releasing some of their liquids, it's generally okay to do so as long as you still keep an eye on it. Again, about 4 minutes until the onion starts to get translucent. Things will start to release their juices and the smell is going to become even more terrific. Now you could have used frozen peppers on this. If you did, you needed to make sure that you were careful that you didn't get a lot of splatter out. Next thing I'm going to add is a cup of rice. Now I'm using brown rice because that's my preferred variety, and 2 cups of, I'm using chicken broth. If you wanted to make this totally vegan, you could use a vegetable broth instead. You could also use water if you needed to. These all, however, add a little bit of depth of flavor to it. Also going to add about 1/8 of a teaspoon of turmeric and a 1/2 teaspoon of cumin. We're going to stir these together and let it come to a boil. Now the thing that you have to watch on this, we're going to bring it to a boil and turn it down to cook the rice. The amount of time is going to depend on which kind of rice you buy. If you decide you prefer white rice, that's going to be a different time. If you use a converted rice, that's maybe going to be 30 minutes. If you actually use brown rice, that may be 40-45 minutes. So look on the label of the package of the rice that you buy to figure out how long you're going to have to cook this. Once you get it up to a boil, you're going to turn the heat down, put the lid on it, and then you're not going to open it again until that time has passed, whatever time it ends up being for you. For this one today, I'm using a converted rice, which is a parboiled brown rice, which means there's a little bit of cooking done ahead of time, then they cool it back down so that shortens the cooking time when I'm ready to use it. So instead of 45 minutes, this one's going to cook in about 30 minutes. You can test it at that point in time, but if it's not quite done, then put the lid on it. But try not to open the lid in between because we want that steam that's developing around the rice to be able to be there to cook it. There's also some other ingredients that we're going to add later that we're not adding now because they slow down or stop the cooking of the rice. One of the prime ones being the tomatoes that we're going to add. And so we're going to add those later on after the rice has already become tender. All right. Now when the timer goes off, make sure you test it, pull out a couple of kernels or grains of it and see if it is where you want it to be as far as tenderness. I'm going to stir in the remaining ingredients now. This is about 2 cups of tomatoes. Now these are canned tomatoes, but I drained them fairly well, but I reserved the juice because sometimes with this kind of product you discover that it's too dry, and so we have a little bit of liquid left to stir in it. I'm also going to stir in 2 cups of corn. This can either be fresh corn or frozen corn, or canned corn works equally well. And then a 4-ounce can of chilies. Now here, if you chose, you could actually, if these are mild chilies, you could really perk this up by actually switching to a diced jalapeno here. You might not want to use quite as many. because it is going to add a bit of heat to it, so you're going to have to make that judgment on your own. Also going to stir in 2 cups of black beans. Now the reason we're stirring these in towards the end is because in this case they're already cooked, and we don't want the beans and the corn to be overcooked, particularly the beans, which are going to start to become mushy and fall apart. So at this point, just gently stir them together. Also want to stir in about 1/2 teaspoon of pepper. And I'm going to put in a little bit of salt because I've used ingredients that don't have salt added to them. You probably want to taste to make sure that it's where you want it to be. And I'm actually going to stir in a little bit of that juice from the tomatoes that I had left over. And then these are going to be on the stove just long enough to heat everything through, so 5 minutes or so, and you're going to be ready to eat. I'm going to go ahead and serve this one up. And we'll just kind of pretend that it got hot. It looks like it's steaming fairly well. This will serve 8 people. So it's actually could be used as an entree for a meatless meal, or you could use it as a side salad or a side dish as well. I'm going to put a little bit of green on here just because it looks pretty with green. And that's it. It's black beans and rice. You can use it now with canned or frozen produce. You can use it all summer long as you're beginning to pull peppers and tomatoes and so on out of your garden. It's the perfect dish for gardening in Oklahoma. I hope you'll give it a try. For Oklahoma Gardening, I'm Barbara Brown.
To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We wish to thank our generous underwriters, TLC Garden Centers, Southwood Landscape and Garden Center, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, and the Oklahoma Horticultural Society.